Hey, hi Booktube, Aaron here. I hope you're doing okay. Today I've got a bit of a response video really to a video that Joe Spivey made. So it was a couple of weeks ago, so I've been a bit slow. But Joe made a video about bookish fidelity. It was a very, very funny and entertaining video, so I'll leave it down below. Um, and essentially, Joe is a reader, as I suppose as Daniel from Guilty Feet would put it. He's a bookish monogamist, so he just reads one book at once. Um, Whereas I'm, I suppose, a bookish polygamist, or as Joe Spivey put it in this video, a bookish infidel. And I constantly have multiple books going on at once. Um, and since this is such a different kind of reading to what Joe normally does, he had quite a few questions for bookish infidels such as me, about what it's like, how it works, and I'm going to do my best to answer these questions. Although I do feel like it's going to be a bit of a disappointment, but we'll see how it goes. And I'll leave, so I'll leave Joe's video down below, and I'll leave the questions down below as well. Um, they're sort of paraphrased, I think, from how from what Joe said. So apologies if I've misunderstood them. But the first question was about recollection. So if you've got multiple books going on at once, do you remember less, or actually does it help you to remember what's going on in each book? Um, and I don't really know whether it has a positive or negative effect when it comes to memory. I certainly have no problem remembering what's going on. I remember as much as is necessary. If for me to keep reading and for me to think about the book after I've finished reading it. And I would say I'm trying to get a bit better at this, but at the moment, what I tend to do is, if a quote jumps out at me, I tend to write it down as well, and say what book it's from, and put the page number down, and things like that. So um, it's not just going to be read and forgotten. But yeah, certainly reading multiple books at once, it doesn't have a negative impact on my recollection of each book. The second question is, do you have a process? So are there set times for readings, or do you read X book on Monday and Y on Tuesday, and so on? Or are there set amounts of each book that you'll read each day? And he also asked whether you're drawn to a certain book over others that you're reading. And I don't really have a process. I will try and go into um, I kind of have an ideal of how my reading should be, and this doesn't always work. So I'll go into the ideal, and then I'll give some examples of then how that how the spanner gets thrown in the works. So my original ideal was to have one book of fiction and one book of poetry being read at once. Um, and to be fair, normally one will take the emphasis over the other, so that effectively it is almost like just reading one book at once. At least this is kind of how it started. And so to give examples with what I'm reading at the moment, there might be War and Peace by Tolstoy. So this is the fiction I have going on at the moment. And then there's this is the first, the Half Finished Heaven by Thomas Transtromer. So we've got some fiction and poetry going on at once. The nice thing with that is that with poetry, the work that you're assessing really is each individual poem. So some poems might sort of work into each other, and sometimes you'll have longer poems. But generally, I'll just read a handful of poems at once, particularly if I'm really enjoying the poet. And then I want to give each poem a bit of breathing room, and so it's useful to put those, put the poetry collection down and just read a totally different kind of book. So that's kind of the thinking behind having two books at once. But then it kind of grew from there. So then I sort of realised I might want to have some non-fiction going at the same time. So, for example, at the moment I'm reading the Diaries of Franz Kafka. So, if I was being good and I was just reading my ideals, I would just be reading the Diaries of Kafka, The Half-Finished Heaven by Thomas Transtromer, and War and Peace. And really, War and Peace is the main one, and I'm dipping into these. If it was a shorter novel or more of a sort of picaresque novel or something like that, maybe the non-fiction would sort of take over. It depends on the individual books, but that's kind of the ideal. However, sometimes there are reading events, or I just decide to take on a longer reading project, and so that kind of adds on to that little pile. So, for example, at the moment, I'm reading The Divine Comedy by Dante, and it's I started in August. I'll be finishing around Easter. I can't remember which way round we are. I think it's an early Easter this year. I think can't quite remember. Yeah, I think Easter is in March this year, um, and so I'm still going to be reading it for a few months yet. And so again, if I was just reading this and nothing else, and I was reading it at that pace, I wouldn't really be reading very much each day. And so for me, for various reasons, I'm sure we'll get into, I just prefer to have um, little chunks of a variety of books, I suppose, to put it kind of succinctly. I'll give a couple of other examples. So back in sort of February through to April 2022, I was a judge for the Booktube Prize. I was judging translated fiction, and I had to read I think it was 6 books in 6 weeks, something like that. And they sort of range from short books like this. This is Chasing Homer by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, which I read pretty much in one sitting. So you may say I was reading one book at once when I was reading this, but that wouldn't be quite fair. There were other things going at once. Or bigger books like this. This is the Morning Star by Karl Ove Knausgaard. So sort of big books, and I had a dedicated time frame to read them in. However, there are also books that I wanted to read too. During March, it's March of the Mammoths, and I was reading War and Peace for the first time. I was reading this edition, the Pevier and Volkonsky translation. And so this was a book that I had more in the background, and I was just reading, most days, just tiny chunks of, um, where and when I could. And then if I had the time for any solid reading, I would sort of pick up the dedicated book for the Booktube Prize, whichever one I was reading at that time, so I could get them done, basically. So yeah, I tend to have these projects going on in the background. Proust is a similar example. I was reading that in a similar way to War and Peace, just in tiny, tiny chunks. And sometimes I would go a couple of weeks without reading anything from Proust. And other books I'd reading would just take precedence, and I'd just come back to this whenever I could. Um, so that's roughly my process. I have a rough idea of what I want to do, but also I quite often just throw that out the window as well. Um, and sometimes I want to have a book going on with my Kindle at the same time, which is something I'm considering right now. So I'm considering throwing the histories by Herodotus into the mix, which probably means I would sort of pause the Diaries of Franz Kafka, and that kind of works with Kafka as well. It's sort of working to what kind of book each book is. Um, since there's no particular narrative to it, it's just his notebooks, and so I can put them aside for a few days or a week or two while I read the histories, and I can go back to it, and I'm not really going to have to recollect much because it's all kind of all over the place with Kafka. So yeah, there's in short, no real set plan, although there's an ideal in the back of my head. Number three is, what is your upper limit? So maybe how many books do you read at once, or maybe a limit to how many of each kind of book. There's no real set limit for me. Ideally, I wouldn't want to be reading more than 5 books at once. There was a really quite scary time. I'm trying to find the books to show you. I've put these all down in the wrong order. There was a point when I was reading 8 books at once, I think, and that was just because it's like in the summer of 2020, didn't have much to do, and I just realised how many books I wanted to read and had unread. Um, and I can't remember all of the books that I had. I can remember having just a massive pile on the arm of the sofa, just kind of just balancing there, um, of sort of 7 or 8 books, and among them, and probably the two chunkers that were taking up a lot of that space were the Divine Comedy. And so again, a book I've now read before, but in a different translation. So that was the first time I read the Divine Comedy, and I read this quite slowly, I think, over the course of the summer. And this is the collected poems of Robert Lowell, which I think I began in the spring, and I was just dipping in and out of because it's like it's 1,000 pages of poetry, um, and it is essentially multiple poetry collections, all sort of in a one big volume. And so it would have been quite a lot and very samey to read this all in one go. So I was just dipping in and out of this from the spring up until about October, and then there were other novels sort of going in and out from there. I think I read I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, and The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. I read some Ted Chiang at that period, and yeah, sort of other things. So I had plenty going on, and again, it was because I had these big projects going. However, I wouldn't want to be reading 7 or 8 books. I want to limit it to about 5, and really, ideally, I would want it to be less than 5, because as a lot of these questions are sort of getting to, that there is the potential that you do lose focus. The more books you have going at once, and I do, I it's not really a problem for me if I'm reading 2 or 3 books. If I'm reading 5 or 6 books, it might be a problem. Um, he also asks, how do you stay sane? The short answer to that is that I don't. Number 4 is, were you ever a reader who read one book from start to finish? And I was, and I was looking back at it, and so initially I was, and I think essentially the way it works, I went to uni, had to read all these books for uni, and then about halfway through, in my second year, I just decided to start reading The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. And again, I was just dipping in and out of this, really. And then once I'd finished all of my essays at the end of the year, I finished it off. Um, and so I think that's the time I started. However, there are times in quite recent memory, just a couple of years ago, just before I started the channel, actually, where looking back, I can see that I was actually in certain periods just reading one book at once. I think it was the after finishing uh, those sort of 7 or 8 books that I had piled up on the sofa. Um, I think it was quite a lot, and so as an effect of that, I think I did have a few weeks where I just decided to read one book at once, more or less. I think I might be remembering wrong. Um, and so then I think I've kind of answered the 5th question, which is, if so, how did this change, or why did this change? Um, it was quite an organic thing. I just decided to pick up another book. Is the short answer, and that kept happening. Number 6 is, do you ever feel the need to flick back? So again, that's kind of going back to the first question about recollection, and memory. Um, and for me, I don't really. So back when I was reading Proust, as I said, I could leave it a few weeks without picking it up, and yeah, didn't really have a problem. So sometimes I'd leave it halfway through a conversation, and as soon as I picked as soon as I picked the book back up, I was immediately back in the world of that book. And again, I think that's, it's just I suppose this kind of reading has developed around me just because it suits my personality and the brain and the way my brain works. And so it's not terribly planned. I'm not terribly good at being planned and working to a timetable or a very rigid kind of routine. Number seven is, do you feel like you can get through boring books with greater efficiency this way? I would say I would. I do feel a little bad calling certain books boring, but certainly to interpret it a little different, and that is paraphrasing Joe's actual question. Um, Something like this: that the House of Government, which is a massive sort of 800-page non-fiction book about the Russian Revolution. There was lots of new information here to me, and it did take a while just for me to get through each page. And so with this one, I did just want to read it in snatches and try to process what I was reading, and then I would read something else that I'd be able to sort of change gears with, I suppose. Because I'm not sure if I've said it yet, but definitely for me, it's better that I um, have multiple books around me and I just keep on reading, even if that is better books, rather than I read a few pages of one book and then get up and decide to do something else. I would prefer to be, you know, reading for as long as I can, even if it's not as many books. Um, but yeah, it certainly does help with the denser books and the books I don't feel quite as home with as at home with. Um, yeah, it does help. Number eight is, how does it affect your reading totals? Do you read more this way, or does it inhibit your reading? Back when I was reading eight books at once, I think it did inhibit my reading, because there was a bit of option paralysis once you have so many books going at once, at least for me. Um, Whereas, yeah, generally, the way I have it at the moment, it has actually helped me read more. And again, going back to what I was saying just a second ago, it is because I'm spending more time reading. Whereas if I was just reading one book, I might actually be spending less time reading. Probably just because I've got terrible attention span, but who knows? And then the last question, at least the last question I've got down here, is, how would you recommend someone to go through with this? Um, and again, my honest answer is I don't really know if I could. Um, and again, as I was saying earlier, I read this way just because it's the way that works for me. So if you are someone where it just works better for you and makes more sense to you just to read one book at once, then I wouldn't feel any pressure to change that. I wouldn't say that one way was better than the other. It's just what suits you in your circumstances, and your personality and the way your brain works. So I don't know if I could sort of push this on someone who naturally tends to read differently. But yeah, again, I would say that for me, it's just useful to be reading different kinds of books at once. And I think that's the kind of key to it for me, is that when I can, I try to be reading different kinds of books at once. Um, I think I'll leave it there. So I'll have the questions underneath. I'll have Joe's video underneath, if you haven't seen that. and I won't weaponize this into a tag. However, if you do want to answer this question, if you are a person who reads multiple books at once, I'm sure Joe won't mind you weaponizing it or responding yourself. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.